I really love roguelites, and so I'm excited to do a roguelite tier list. I played 63 games, if I've counted them correctly, and now we're going to go through all of them one by one and rank them into one of these 6 categories. So this can be a more casual video than some of my others where I script them out. This is off the cusp and unscripted. So if you're not familiar with the tier list, basically what that is it's a quick way of ranking whatever you're going to rank. So in this case, we're going to be ranking all the roguelites that I played into 6 different categories. S plus for me are basically my top 5 or so favorite roguelites. It's going to be a pretty small category there. S for me are roguelites I consider great. So some of the best roguelites, but not necessarily my favorites. And A plus are what I'll call good and good, but not quite great roguelites. So I expect about 80% of the games that I review and rank to be in these 3 categories, S, A plus, and A. And finally, we have B and C. B are games that have some good redeeming qualities, but have some major flaws in terms of replayability or just something core to the game that isn't quite right. Maybe not enough content, something along those lines to make it not quite good enough to go in A tier. And C tier is my bottom tier, basically games where I don't really see the point in playing them. I wouldn't recommend them to anyone. Most of them are games that I've tried, played a little bit, and couldn't really get into, didn't really have any fun playing. That should be hopefully a pretty small tier. So yeah, why don't we just get started? And for each of these games, I'm going to give a sentence or 2 description about the game, and then I'm going to rank them based on how I feel. These aren't really going to be reviews. If you want that type of content, you can see plenty of that on my channel, both in-depth and short form. Let's start with Adore, which is a monster tamer top-down action roguelite by a Brazilian developer. Has a really gorgeous art style. It's also early access, so it's not quite finished yet. I'm going to rank early access games as they are right now, as opposed to where they might be at some point in the future. I think Adore is in A game. It's pretty fun. It has a lot of good qualities to it. I enjoyed playing through it. As I mentioned already, the art style is really gorgeous. The monster taming aspect is fun, but the combat feels a little shallow at times. You don't have quite as much control. It's not as tight of a combat system as some other games. Additionally, I think the difficulty needs to be tweaked a little bit. Maybe it has been. I haven't played it since they've updated it a couple times, but it was so punishing that I felt like I was missing something. It felt just really hard to make any progress. And so yeah, it's a fun game. Definitely can use a little work. I think it has potential to get higher up there through some later updates, but that's where I'd put it right now. Astronarch, I'll put this in A plus for now. So Astronarch is a auto battler roguelite where you build up a party of heroes, you equip them with items, level up their passive and active skills, and fight through a series of enemies. And there are a lot of choices around what enemies you fight, whether you want to do some events between fights, those kind of things. Overall, it's a really fun game. I'm kind of split between S and A plus for this one. Compared to some other auto battler roguelites, I think it has a lot of depth to the gameplay and the strategy. I'm not quite sure if I would put it in S tier. I think it's missing in some areas that would put it into S if they were addressed. So I think the enemy variety is a little low, some things like that. I mean, it's an auto battler, so it's pretty passive to begin with. Maybe some balancing, but I feel good about A plus for this for now. Maybe we'll come back to that and change it at some point in the future. Asura, I think that I'm fine putting this in A tier as well. It's overall a pretty decent game, has some fun gameplay, does some things well, but kind of falls flat in other areas. So Asura is a top-down action roguelite where you play as Asura from Indian folklore, and you fight through this series of rooms, different enemies, and you power yourself up, get loot, those kind of things as you fight through. I like some of the mechanics in here, such as being able to use enemies in both looting for XP and looting for gold for items. And it has some cool skill trees and stuff like that, but it feels a little bland compared to some other roguelites out there. There's not as much depth. The rooms are pretty basic, the map layout. So I think A tier is a perfectly fine ranking for that game. Does some things good, has some flaws, kind of balanced. Next game, Basingstoke. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. It's a roguelite stealth game of sorts. There's 2 game modes. There's a campaign, which focuses on stealth, and there's an arcade mode that focuses on surviving as long as you can. And there are also some crafting elements and those kind of things. I did not really like this game at all. I don't think it's really the game for me, partly because I don't really enjoy stealth games that much, so it might be a little unfair to put things in C tier. Although really anything I put in C tier or S plus is, pretty biased because those are my favorites or games I couldn't really play or games that I just didn't really enjoy. but it just didn't really click for me. The stealth wasn't very satisfying. Certainly the arcade roguelite last as long as you can mode was not really satisfying. It felt very shallow. There wasn't much to do there, not much depth. I don't really see a reason to play this game that much. Maybe if you want a stealth game, maybe there's something there that really appeals to stealth players, but I didn't really have much enjoyment playing through this. Next, Children of Morta. I think this is a really great game. I just played this past few weeks. I'm going to do a longer review on this in the next few weeks. It's a really fun game, and it's a pretty story-driven, progression-heavy ARPG roguelite. It has a feel of Diablo at times, those type of games, and you play as this family that you level up individually. Each character has a different skill tree, and you also level up the family together through increasing their health, attack, those kind of things between runs. And they also added another game mode recently called the Family Trials mode. That's a more classic roguelite format. So I'll put this in A+. I think there's a lot of things I really like about it. The combat itself is fun. It's satisfying. I like the story. I liked about 80% of the story. There's a couple of things they do in it that I really didn't like at all. But for most of the story, I enjoyed it. The combat's fun. The Family Trials mode has been very fun to play through, and I've been enjoying that. So I'll put this in A+. Not quite S tier because I think it fails a little bit in terms of character balance. Some of the characters feel way better than each other. The main game mode is really grindy. And the story, as I mentioned, I like 80% of it, but a couple of things really kind of killed the story for me at the end. So because the story fell flat, a little grindy, not as balanced character-wise as I would love, I'm going to put it in A+ instead of S tier. Next, we have Crowntakers, which is a turn-based tactical roguelite on a hex grid format with an overworld elements as well, where you can explore these areas, loot, level up your heroes, those kind of things. I think that I'll put Crowntakers in A tier. It's a fun game. It does some things well, but it's also not really spectacular in any particular way. It has some nice combat systems, some nice progression, nice leveling up, but it doesn't really feel super unique. It doesn't feel that great in terms of enemy variety, things like that. And there is also a non-roguelite mode where you keep progression, all of it across runs. So if you don't want to play a roguelite where you lose everything, you want some progression, there is that option for you. But as a whole, it does some things well, does some nice things. I had fun playing through it, but it's not that special, not that deep in terms of gameplay, not as much variety as you would want from a game that I would put higher up here. So Curse of the Dead Gods is a isometric action roguelite that has a Souls-like feel to it, has super tight combat. It's very punishing, but very rewarding when you do things well, has a stamina system. So it's a punishing, isometric, Souls-like RPG roguelite, and I will put this in S tier. So this will be our first S tier roguelite of the video. Curse of the Dead Gods is just really great. It has really responsive combat, and that combat is really what pulls it to S tier alone. It's just a really satisfying combat system that's really tight, really punishing, but rewarding when you do really well, when you actually learn it. And it has some nice combos and synergies as well. Though I think it lacks a bit in terms of variety of movesets of weapons and a couple other elements, such as difficulty getting just extremely hard at certain points. And there are certain things like you get hit by attacks you don't think you should that can be a little frustrating at times. But if you want a punishing roguelite, it's definitely there. And it's just, as a whole, a really great roguelite. So I'll put that in S tier for me. Some people might put it in S+. I think really for me, the lack of weapon variety really keeps it lower, as well as a couple other things that make it not one of my top 5 games, but it's probably top 10 still. And so really good game. You put that in S tier. Darkest Dungeon. This is a hard one. I'm not entirely sure where I want to put Darkest Dungeon. I really like a lot of things of Darkest Dungeon. So Darkest Dungeon is a punishing, turn-based RPG dungeon crawler game where you build up a party of heroes in your town and you go on runs into the various dungeons around and fight through enemies, etc. It's really good in terms of the depth of combat. It's really good in terms of knowledge rewards you. If you learn the enemies, if you learn your characters well, you can really be rewarded for that with how you play through the game. It's really bad in terms of its punishing nature, and there's a grind attached to it. So when one of the members of your parties dies, you have to get a new member of the party and level them back up across runs to get them to the same place. There's things like that that don't make it as fun. And that punishing nature is also combined with RNG. So it's a very RNG heavy game. You can manage that RNG a lot. And if you want to go far, you have to manage that RNG a lot. You have to learn what to do to mitigate those chances. But you're really just playing around with different numbers. What's the percent chance of you getting one shot? You can take it from a 10% chance to a 1% chance, but you're just playing around with the number there. So I think because of that RNG, I think I'm going to put it in A+. Love-hate relationship with the game. Do I want to put it in S tier? I don't know. We'll put it in A+ for now. Maybe we'll revisit that at the end. It could certainly go in S tier depending on what other games we put where. So A+ for now, though. So Darksburg is an ARPG roguelite where you defend against a zombie horde and fight your way through to try to clear certain areas and progress as you can, culminating in a boss fight. You can play as one of 5 different heroes, if I remember correctly. Darksburg is one of the more disappointing games that I played. I'm going to put it in B tier for now. And it's disappointing because I really liked the combat and I had fun with it. And the game has a lot of potential, but it's basically kind of abandoned. It feels abandoned. It's actually not abandoned because the developers said recently they have more updates planned for it, but it feels unfinished. It had maybe the quickest drop-off fun-wise of any roguelite that I played, where it was really, really fun for a run or two. And every time booted up, it's fun for one run, maybe 2. And then it falls off so quickly because it just lacks a lot of enemy variety. It lacks a lot in terms of skill variety. There's just not the content there to sustain it. So I'm going to put it in B tier because it has a really big fatal flaw of that lack of content. And so I wouldn't really recommend it to anyone unless they're okay with there not being much content. And that's probably not why you're playing roguelites in the first place. So now let's rank Dead Cells. And if you're not familiar with Dead Cells is a platform roguelite with punishing but incredibly tight combat that just feels really good to play through. It has some Metroidvania elements as well, and that's sort of some of the progression there. And also has a ton of unlocks and weapons, all with their own movesets and different skills and stuff as well. I'm going to put this in S+ tier. Dead Cells is one of my top 5 roguelites. It's incredibly fun, incredibly rewarding. I was really hooked on the game from the first time that I played it. It just feels so fun. It feels so responsive. The combat really pulls it through. Obviously, it has some flaws, but nothing that would put it out of S+ for me. Though I would note, if you're not familiar with it, it's a pretty punishing game. You don't have to climb the difficulty levels if you don't want to, but the base difficulty of the game is perhaps harder than some of the other games on here. So that's something to keep in mind, but overall, really great game. And there's some DLCs as well, but I think it's S+ even without those 2 DLCs, but certainly S+ with them. And yeah. Next, let's look at Dicey Dungeons. Sorry about some of these portraits where they have some of the titles cut off, but next for Dicey Dungeons. So this is a game, it feels a little different than a lot of other roguelites. It's not a traditional roguelite in that sense, but basically turn-based RPG where you play as one of 6 dice that all feel different from each other, have their own movesets, have their own active abilities, and you can manage your equipment between fights and bring different abilities, attacks, those kind of things into each combat. So I think this is probably an A+ game. It's really fun. I really enjoyed playing through it, and it has a good amount of variety to there as well. It has some things that are really easy and has some games, some missions, whatever you want to call them, that are more challenging. I don't think it's quite S+ because it has some flaws in terms of replayability because of its structure. Your goal really is to clear these 36 missions, and once you've cleared one of them, you usually don't go back to replay them, which is not what you usually expect from other roguelites, but it is really fun to play through that variety, the challenges that come with them, and all of those things. So A+ for the quality of the game, not higher because of the limited replayability and factors in that regard. It's pretty RNG heavy, but it's usually not RNG heavy enough that you feel screwed over by the RNG, or at least I haven't. I know some other people who have complained about the game didn't really like that RNG aspect, but I mean, it's called Dicey Dungeons. I don't know what you expect. There's going to be some dice rolls involved. So now let's look at Downwell. I'm going to put this in A tier. So Downwell is a 2D pixel art roguelite where your goal is to climb down this well, hence the name. And your goal basically is to fall down through this well and kill enemies when you can, either by jumping on them or killing them with your attack and not get hit by them so you don't take damage, and just see how far that you can go. And there's a bunch of power-ups and stuff, some cosmetic progression and unlocks in that way, but no vertical progression at all. It's a pretty simple game, but it's very fun for what it is. It's not trying to be more than what it is. So I think it kind of understands that it's a simple game, and it's good for that. It's fun for that, but there's just not as much depth as some of the higher up games. So that's why it's an A tier, fun, but probably not a game that your average player will spend a couple 100 hours on. It's just not that type of game. Now, Dungeon of the Endless. This is one of the first roguelites that I played, actually. It's really good in some ways and kind of suffers a lot in others. I'm going to put this in A tier for now. I really like the overall systems in place. So what it is it's a combination of tower defense elements and RPG roguelite. It has a real-time with pause, pseudo-turn-based nature to it. So you can pause the game and queue up actions. You can also just play it live, whatever you want to do. I really like the game as a whole. It has some really fun times, but really the biggest flaw with the game is that it has a lot of downtime that's kind of hard to skip within each run. So the runs might be an hour, hour and a half, and you might spend 30 minutes of those kind of farming up for later runs. And that farming up can be a little boring at times. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in A. I think it's one of the more unique roguelites. I don't think there's anything quite like it. Maybe Atomic Crops. I haven't really played that, so that's why I thought on here. But I think it's a unique roguelite. Has some things it does really well, but kind of suffering from some pacing issues and suffering from some variety issues, and also has a kind of a weird learning curve where it feels incredibly hard and punishing. And then once you learn a few tricks, learn a few strategies, it becomes much more trivial in a way that's kind of weird. But yeah, A tier for that. And next, we'll put Enter the Gungeon. I think Enter the Gungeon, I'm going to put it in A+. I know a lot of people, it's their favorite roguelites. For me, I've played Enter the Gungeon a couple times. I've never really gotten that into it. It's always fun to play through. I've never hated playing through it or anything, but it's never really hooked me either. So Enter the Gungeon is a top-down action roguelite with a lot of bullet hell elements and a focus on progression that adds a lot of variety to the game and replayability as opposed to any vertical progression. It's generally considered one of the better roguelites, one of the more popular roguelites for sure, but it's never been enough to be S tier for me personally, though I do think it's a really good game, and there's just a lot of content there. So A+ for me. Feel free to argue if you think it should go higher. And actually for all of these, if you disagree with me, if you think that there's something that I'm missing for any of these games, or if you think that any of these games should be lower than I put them, I would love to hear your opinion. So you can put that in the comments as well if you're interested. Next, For the King. I think this is probably A tier for me. So it's a turn-based tabletop game inspired roguelite that you can play co-op as well with up to 2 other friends, a 3-person party. And it has some things that I like about it. The class system's kind of fun. The combat itself is fun. It has a lot of baked-in RNG, so it really feels like that dice roll you would have in tabletop games. I think the reason I would put it A and not A+ is that it lacks a bit in terms of variety. You can play through different campaigns, but within each campaign, the games feel very similar run to run, or at least they have in my experience. And it also is one of the only games that I played that feels worse to play co-op than it does single player. And that's because it just feels so slow when you play co-op. The pacing is really bad. And really the runs themselves are also really long. It sounds like I'm dragging this game a lot. I actually did have fun with it. I think it's a good game. That's why I'm putting it in A tier. But I'm not going to put it higher because of some pacing issues. The runs are 4 hours long sometimes. They just feel really long. But overall, a solid game. Next, we're going to look at FTL, Faster Than Light. I'm going to put this game in S tier. So FTL is a real-time with pause, pseudo-turn-based game where your goal is to fly through space with your spaceship, and you fight through enemy spaceships as you encounter them, complete random events, gear up your spaceship, and try to get to the boss and defeat it. It's a really fun game. It's pretty simple. It also runs on low system requirements, but it has a lot of depth to it. So it's pretty easy to get into, but it's very hard to master. And there's just a ton of variety in terms of what setups you can have, what ships you can play with, and there's just so much content there. So even through my own time playing through the game, I feel like there's so much that I haven't seen and that I really want to see. So I'm really excited to keep playing this more. And yeah, I think it's just a really great game. And you should check it out definitely if you haven't. It's a classic, but it's definitely a really good game, even though it's one of the older roguelites on this list. Next, we're going to look at Genesis Alpha 1. And this is an FPS roguelite with some management aspects as well, where your goal is to build up your spaceship collect resources from the planets around, collect resources from the galaxies that you fly through, and use that to find a suitable home for humanity or something like that. It's not really story driven though. It's kind of exploration and management focused. I'm going to put it in B tier. I think this game to some things has some ideas that I really like. I like the idea of building up this ship. I like the idea and some of the mechanics involved with how you can upgrade your crew. But in terms of execution, it just never felt fun to me. It never felt enjoyable to play through, which is kind of a big deal. I'm not going to put it in C tier because I do think that it has some qualities that are cool, but it felt like a management sim almost that was put into an FPS format, and that just didn't really work. I felt like I was doing chores a lot, which doesn't work as well in an FPS format as it would in a top-down format. It felt like I was running around to kill infestations on the ship, things like that, and it just wasn't very fun. So yeah, I'm going to put that in B tier and move on. So next is Going Under, which I'm going to put this in A+. I haven't finished this game yet. I haven't gotten a full clear, although really there's multiple dungeons you can clear. So Going Under is an action roguelite that has a satirical theme to it about businesses and startups and that kind of culture and ecosystem. And I really enjoyed the story aspects to it. So there is some progression both in terms of items and unlocks, as well as some story you can do across runs. And that aspect of the game I really enjoyed. However, I didn't like the combat that much. I don't think the combat is bad, but it doesn't feel that unique. It has some systems like a Breath of the Wild type durability system that I didn't enjoy that much, but maybe some people would. So overall, I'd probably put the combat in probably an A tier. I think the non-combat elements of the games are probably an S tier. So because of that, split the difference, put it in A+. And yeah, next we're going to rank GoNNER. And this is a platformer action roguelite where you play as this little guy and you fight through a series of caves, I guess. It's kind of a weird game. I'm going to put this in B tier. I never really enjoyed playing through it. It's pretty punishing, but it's also very confusing. It doesn't really explain things to you at all. So I know sometimes that can be a positive to some people, but I also couldn't really figure them out on my own. So it was kind of an L for me all around in terms of playing this game. I don't think I'm going to put it in C tier because I think it has some redeeming qualities in terms of the depth of gameplay, perhaps some of the guns and stuff. But yeah, I just didn't really enjoy playing through it. Maybe I should put... No, I'm going to keep it in B tier. So moving on to Griftlands. This is a really great game. I'm going to put this in S tier. So Griftlands is a somewhat story-driven RPG card game roguelite. It feels like a mix of a card game and a turn-based RPG, and it has a lot of story elements, though. Also, you can skip them all if you don't want that. But it has a cool world to explore. You can play as 3 different characters now. It had its full release recently, and it just feels really fun to play through. It feels really satisfying. The characters all feel different from each other in a good way, although I haven't really played the third character that much. But it's a really fun game and really great for what it is. I think it has some flaws in terms of maybe replayability limitations. The runs are so long, they don't feel as fun to repeat. But they've addressed some of that with daily runs, things like that. And I think it's a really great game for what it is right now. Certainly a roguelite that I recommend to anyone who wants to play a card game roguelite or a turn-based RPG type roguelite. Very good as a whole. And now we're going to look at Gunfire Reborn, which is still in early access right now. I'm going to put this in A+. So Gunfire Reborn is an FPS roguelite where you fight through a series of rooms and areas, clear enemies within them, and beat some bosses as well. It's also a very co-op focused roguelite. So if you're looking for an FPS co-op game, Gunfire Reborn is a great choice for that. And overall, I think it's a good game, so I'm going to put it in A+. The combat's fun. It's great for co-op. That's what I've been playing a lot of it as. It has some downsides, though, in terms of some of the fighting isn't as fun as it could be. There's things like super tight corridors, feeling a little cramped. It's a little grindy. It's very progression focused. They revamped that a week or two ago, which I haven't fully explored, but I think it's still pretty grindy. And there's some limitations there because of that. It's kind of hard. It takes a while to unlock all the characters, even though I'd love to try some of them sooner, get some more gameplay variety. But yeah, it's a really fun game. Nice characters, they feel different from each other, but lacks a bit in terms of some of the design choices, and feels a little unfinished in some areas because it's still early access. So we're going to put that in A+ for now. And next we're going to look at Hadean Tactics, which is an auto battler card game roguelite that has a kind of a cool mix between those two elements. So basically, you set up your characters, you can level up between fights, And then every once in a while in a combat, the fight will pause and you can play your cards for various effects. So it's still pretty early in early access. I think it's gone through maybe 1 or 2 major updates. And so I would put it probably an A tier right now. I think it's still pretty fun. It's just lacking a lot of content. There's not that much to do right now. And it has some weird difficulty curves where it's kind of easy and you get to the final boss and it's really hard. But as a whole, biggest issue right now is just lacking content. You can only start with 1 hero still, I think. And once they address those, I think it has potential to be A+ game, maybe an S game, maybe not. But it's a pretty good game right now, fun for what it is, but just lacking too much content to put much higher than A. And now we're going to rank Hades, which if you're not familiar with Hades, you probably don't follow roguelites that closely. But I'm going to put Hades in S+. It's my personal favorite roguelite still. I played it the most out of all the games on this list. And so Hades is a hack and slash, isometric, action roguelite where you play as Zagreus, the son of Hades. And really what separates Hades from every other game on this list is that it has the best storytelling that I've ever seen in a roguelite. And the way it does that is the story progresses because you die and as you die and as you clear it. So it really responds to all aspects of the roguelite experience, as opposed to when other roguelites have stories, they usually either dismiss the fact that you're going on runs that you die at all, or they kind of hand wave it away by saying you don't die or different timelines, those kind of things. But Hades really mixes those narrative elements with the roguelite elements in a way that's unique and incredibly satisfying, with a gorgeous art style, with great voice acting, all those things. I don't think I need to justify why I'm putting Hades in S+ more than that. It's a pretty popular roguelite, maybe the most popular there is, maybe not as popular as Isaac, but certainly up there. So moving on, we're going to look at Into the Breach. And I think I'm going to put this in A+. Yeah, so Into the Breach is a tactical, turn-based, strategy-focused roguelite where you play as a team of 3 mechs that you can customize before your run, and you can level up these mechs, upgrade them with different equipment, and you use these mechs to fight the Vek, which are these insect-like enemies. It's really fun for what it is. It has some nice strategy elements. You know, it is a tactical roguelite. There's some nice risk-reward mechanics you can take on. There's different ways of beating the game, as different difficulties, different clear lengths, which I'm not going to explain too much here, but you can go for score challenges. It has a lot of things there that are nice, but really, I think it's more of a variety-focused roguelite in terms of if you want to get a lot of replayability out of it, you have to be willing to try different mech teams, go for that variety focus, because it's pretty easy to beat just a run with. I think the base difficulty isn't that hard. So A+ because it's really fun, pretty easy to get into, but not quite S tier because I think it lacks some in regards to replayability compared to these other games. And now we're going to look at Iris and the Giant. So this is a card game roguelite with some story-heavy elements. So basically you play as Iris, and you use cards to fight off these giants, and obviously a turn-based like format, as most card games are. And it has a kind of unique element where as you use cards, they get destroyed, so you have to constantly replenish your deck and find cards along the way. I'm going to put this in A tier. It has some elements that I really like to it. I think the card mechanics and the way they work are unique, but I think it lacks in depth compared to some other card games in regards to how you can build up your deck. It's not really a deck builder per se, so much as it is a card game. And I think it's lacking in regard to some other elements as well. It has some story-heavy narrative elements. They're very melancholic, kind of talking about Iris, the main character's struggles with mental health issues, but it's not enough story elements and stuff that I would want to raise it, given that the gameplay itself is good, but nothing that spectacular. And moving on, we're going to look at Lethal Running. And so Lethal Running is kind of a confusing game. This is one of the games that was given to me to review as a free review copy. And I played through it a couple of times and don't really know what to think of it in regards to what the game is about. So it's kind of based on Running Man, the movie, or like Hunger Games, where you play as a character in this game show-like environment and try to fight through, survive, progress, make the fans happy, those kind of things. I'm going to put this in C tier because I couldn't really get into this game. I did try a couple times, but I didn't really know what was going on. The controls were clunky. I didn't know what to do. So because of that, I wasn't really having fun. I think it's still in early access. I'm not entirely sure, but it needs some work. I think there is some potential for a good game under this. I like the theme. That's why I decided to try it in the first place. I think there's some way you could go with that, but it's lacking in terms of explanations. And it's just, yeah, I don't think I'm going to talk about that game that much more, but I hope to see it improved in the future because I think it has some potential, as I've said. And now we're going to look at Loop Hero, which is a kind of unique roguelite, maybe one of the most unique roguelites on this list. It mixes tile management, card game elements, auto battler, idle elements, tower defense-ish kind of elements, heavy progression, story elements. I'm not exactly sure where I want to rank Loop Hero. I think I'm going to put it in S tier. I really enjoyed playing through it. I had a lot of fun playing through it. I think it has one of the better stories and narratives of any roguelite. I think the way it addresses the roguelite elements, I really enjoyed. As I mentioned earlier with Hades, I really like games that actually address and acknowledge the fact that they're roguelites, don't just kind of sweep it under the rug, which is something that Griftlands does. It's very story focused, but it's not a roguelite story, if that makes sense. So Loop Hero, I'm going to put it in S tier. It's probably one of the more divisive roguelites because of the auto battler nature, because it has farming runs at times, those kind of things that run counter to the nature of roguelites often. But I had so much fun playing through it, and I like the narrative elements and structure of it enough that I'm going to put it in S tier, though not S+, because of that requirement to farm, because of that grind, because of those elements. Moving on, Luck Be a Landlord. So this is another unique roguelite. It's like a slot machine deck builder roguelite, not a card game, but a deck builder. And so basically you build up a deck of these symbols and you spin the slot machine and you roll symbols like you would a normal slot machine. And based on what symbols you roll and how they synergize with each other, you get money and you use that money to pay rent. If you can't pay rent, then you lose. It's a very unique roguelite, as I've said, and I really enjoy it. It's weirdly addicting, but it's also pretty simple. And so because of that, I'm going to put it in A+ for now. I think it's still early access, and even if it's not, it's certainly getting regular updates, and so it's an unfinished state right now. But it's really weirdly fun, honestly, but just so simple that I can't justify putting it higher than A+. And the next roguelite is Mask Up. And this is a platformer action roguelite where you play as this character with various masks, and you can level up yourself by picking up this currency that you get from killing people or from various items around. And you can use that to evolve in 3 different forms, your base form and 2 stronger ones that have different movesets, different abilities, those kind of things. Overall, it's a fun game, but it's very limited. It's made by a solo dev, and I respect the work they put in. I respect the work that all the developers put in all of these games, even the ones that I put lower on this list. I know that these games take a lot of work, but this game really lacks in terms of replayability. I like it a lot as a concept. I had fun playing through it, but once I played through it a couple of times, I didn't really think that there was much more that I wanted to see. I think the concept kind of played itself out. If it wanted to be higher up, which it could be at some point in the future, I think it would need some more gameplay elements to just add some more replayability, add some more depth to the systems that are there, and build on that good foundation. But a good foundation, not enough to put it above B tier for me. And now we're going to rank Monster Train, which is one of my favorite roguelites. So from that means S+ tier. And so Monster Train is a mix of RPG and card game roguelites, mostly card game, but it has some RPG or unit management elements to it. And in Monster Train, you defend your train from these attackers by playing unit cards, using spells, and various other power-ups that combo and synergize with each other in various ways. It's a really fun game. It's a really combo-heavy game. Obviously, every card game is combo-heavy, but it's really especially combo-heavy at Monster Train. You can get these really fun, just ridiculous combinations that can power your way through everything and beat the various bosses. There was also a DLC release for it somewhat recently, and that DLC added a new final boss, a new clan, just a lot of content. So it's just a really great game. It's one of my more heavily played roguelites, and I've always enjoyed playing through it. It has some minor flaws, but nothing that would put it out of one of my favorite roguelites, because it is one of my favorite roguelites, and so that's why it's S+ for me. Moonlighter. So Moonlighter is a game that is kind of a unique concept. It mixes top-down RPG action roguelite elements with a storefront management shopkeeper element to it as well. So basically you go into dungeons, you kill enemies, you loot them, and you bring back those items, that loot, and sell it in your own shop. I think both these elements by themselves are kind of both okay. The action roguelite elements are fine. The shopkeeper element was also very okay. I don't think it really excelled in either of those areas. And so I think because of that, I'm going to put it in A tier. I just wish that the combat was better. I wish the shopkeeper element was more engaging, but they are both kind of underwhelming. I did really like the ambiance, the environment, the music. It has a good vibe to it, has a good feel to it as you play through it, but it's not the best roguelite if you want a game that's an action roguelite, and I'm sure there are better shopkeeper games out there as well. It just wasn't as satisfying as I'd hoped for, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. And now we're going to look at Neoverse, which is a card game roguelite that feels like an RPG at times. And what makes Neoverse unique from a lot of other card game roguelites is that it has this combo mechanic where if you play certain types of cards in certain orders, you can get new extra combo effects that have big impacts on your fights. So where would I put Neoverse? I think it's just an A tier roguelite. It has some things that are fun, it has some things that are unique, like that combo mechanic. I always enjoyed card game roguelites if they're done well, but it feels a little lacking compared to some of the better card game roguelites on this list, like Monster Train, like Griftlands. It doesn't have some of that same combo potential, and it just feels a little slower, which is kind of a weird complaint to have for a card game roguelite, but the combat itself and the pacing of it doesn't feel as fast-paced as I would hope. It feels a little too slow, and that pacing kind of drags down a little bit, from maybe an A+ to an A game. And now we're going to look at Noita. I think that's how you say it, Noita, which is an interesting game, one of the more unique roguelites as well, where it has this very creative exploration element to it. The pitch of the game is that every pixel is simulated, and every pixel responds differently to other pixels. And so there's just so much to learn about how these different pixels, these different elements interact with each other, how they synergize, what type of combos are there. And there's also just a lot to learn about how you'd use the items that you find and how you use them to interact with your environment around you. I think I did this game a very poor job, not justice at all with how I explained it. It's kind of hard to explain, and this is off the cusp, so I didn't prepare the script for how I would explain this game. But it's really fun, and there's just a lot of depth to the game with what there is to explore, what there is to learn, and the combat. And so because of that depth, because of all those elements to explore, I'm going to put it in S tier. I think there are some limitations on the game. It's pretty punishing, for example. It's pretty easy to die and get punished for small mistakes. It's pretty easy to get punished when you try to learn the things in the game, which is a little unfortunate. But as a whole, there's just so much there to explore. There's so much content, and it just really feels unique and fun to explore those things. I think there's some games that have exploration, but it's not fun to explore. But I think the exploration is fun in Noita, even though I have to be in the right mood to play it. I feel like I have to be in that exploration-focused mood where some of the other games don't have the same mood limitation, if that makes sense. I think as a whole, this game belongs in S tier. And now we're going to look at the first roguelite that I ever played, which is Nuclear Throne. And this is a bullet hell, fast-paced, top-down twin-stick shooter roguelite where you can play as a bunch of different characters, and your goal is to clear through all these areas to reach the Nuclear Throne, the name of the game, as quickly as possible. It also has a lot of secrets and those kind of things to explore, but it's not super heavy on progression. It's a very stripped-down game, but stripped down to the core essentials of what you want from a roguelite, and it's very fun to play through. I'm going to put this game in S tier, I think. Maybe S+. I don't know if I should put it in S+ or S. I just really enjoy the game. It's one of my personal favorites. But I know that part of the reason that I like it so much is because it was the first roguelite that I played. So it's kind of rose-tinted glasses, I think that's the saying. It's a very nostalgia-tinted view of the game. And that's why I put it higher than probably a lot of other people would. I'm going to keep it in S for now. Maybe we'll put it in S+ when I come back to it. But it's just so fun to play through. Very quick games. It is punishing at times, but it always feels like you could have won if you knew what you were doing better, had better experience, those kind of things. And so because of that, it's always very rewarding to play. And it's still one of my most played roguelites, though not as high as some of the other ones up here. So S, not S+, but maybe S+ if we come back to it. So we'll see. Outcast of Orion is another auto-battler roguelite where you build up a party of different characters, where you have a main hero with special abilities, and other standard characters as well. And you level them up between runs, upgrade them with different items, and fight through a series of enemies and bosses in order to beat the game. I think Outcast of Orion has a really great core combat system, so I'm going to put it in A for that. But I'm not going to put it any higher because it has very limited replayability right now. There's just not that much content to see. I played through it a couple times, and I beat it on my second or third try, and then you can beat the game 3 more times, I think, if I remember correctly. It's kind of like a new game plus mode where you fight through the same type of run, but now it's harder and the enemies are harder, and it has a new final boss. And once you beat that, you're kind of just done. And so I'd finished the game in the harsh difficulty in an hour and a half or something like that. So it was really fun. I wish there was more to do. I think it has great core combat, as I've already said, but there's just not enough there. There's not enough replayability there to justify putting it any higher than A. Maybe that's... No, I'm going to keep it in A, not B, because I think the core combat is good enough that it doesn't go in the same tier as these other games. And now we're going to look at Plunge, which is a very unique roguelite as well. I feel like I've said that a lot now, but there are some pretty standard roguelites, and there are some roguelites that feel very different. And Plunge is one of those ones that feels pretty different. I'm going to put it in A tier because it's really fun for what it is. It's a puzzle-like roguelite where you play on this tile grid and try to kill enemies, get a key, and go on to the next room as quickly as possible. If you remember that old board game called Rush Hour, it feels a lot like that in some ways. And I enjoyed Plunge for the puzzle-like qualities. It was always fun when I played through it, but it's limited in terms of replayability. The randomization is a little limited as well. And so because of those variety problems, I'm going to put it in A tier and not any higher. Quest of Dungeons is a classic roguelike with its turn-based combat system in several different classes you can play as, in an RPG system with leveling up, getting various items, those different gameplay elements. I think Quest of Dungeons is not amazing. It does some things fine, but it doesn't really feel special. There are a lot of classic roguelikes out there, and they don't really see a reason to play Quest of Dungeons over those other games that just have so much more depth to them, a lot more classes, a lot more gameplay variety, just so much more to offer than Quest of Dungeons. Maybe somebody else has a different experience with the game, but for me personally, I don't really see a reason to play this over even a game like Tangle Deep that we'll get to later, or just all the classic roguelites that exist, NetHack, Rogue, Add-on, Tome, all of those games. I don't see a reason to play this instead of those. And now, Ring of Pain, I don't know exactly where I want to rank this game. So Ring of Pain is a very unique card game roguelite. It's kind of a reverse card game. It feels more like an RPG than a card game, but you play through these ring of cards that have enemies, item pickups, and various other gameplay elements and surprises. And it's also a very punishing game. So if you make some mistakes, you can die pretty quickly and have to restart your run. I liked Ring of Pain a lot for the unique elements that it brought. I think I'm going to put it in A+. I don't know if it quite deserves to go in S. Ring of Pain does a lot of things really well. It feels very unique. It's fun to play through, but it has some limitations. It has some flaws. Most notably, I think it has a really weird RNG curve where RNG feels really important very early on, and then it feels less important later on, or there's just more counter RNG measures. You feel like you can manage it better. And I also think it lacks a bit in terms of variety. It could use a little bit more in terms of that. And so for those reasons, I'm not going to put it in S, but I think the game is a little underrated. I think it's a little overlooked, and it's a really fun game, really unique game, even if it has some flaws. Now we're going to look at Risk of Rain 2, which is a third-person shooter roguelite. It's kind of like a looter shooter in some ways, where you fight through these areas, loot a bunch of items and chests, and it has a passive stacker quality to it, where you try to stack up as many of these passive elements, these passive items as possible to make yourself stronger. I think Risk of Rain 2 for me is S tier. I don't know if I'm going to put it in S+. I really like it, but it has this weird progression pacing difficulty system where as you play through the runs, the longer you take, the harder it gets. And I understand the point of this. It's to get you to go faster, make you not dawdle, make you not just loot up, but it always feels weird to me. There are times where I just don't loot fast enough and then I get behind, and it just feels like I'm always fighting that difficulty system in a way that I don't really love. But outside of that, it's a really great game in terms of the character variety, the different classes. I've always loved my runs through it. You can play it co-op as well, so it has multiplayer, even though it's all peer-to-peer, no dedicated servers. It's a really fun game. I really recommend it to people if you're looking for a shooter roguelite. It's really great for that. And it also gets a lot of updates. They added a new character recently. Well, they added one character and a secret character recently. And so it's a very loved game. It gets a lot of attention from the developers, even now after release. Risk of Rain 1, I actually didn't mean to include this, so I have not played Risk of Rain 1 enough in order to rank it, so we'll ignore that. Next is Roboquest, which is an FPS roguelite with 2-person co-op and solo play as well. It has an Overwatch-like feel to it at times with the combat system, managing cooldowns. It has a cool art style as well, and great soundtrack, great music. I've always loved that as I've been playing through it. It's still in early access, so it's unfinished. But right now, I'm going to put it in A+ as well. It's just really fun to play through. There's a pretty good variety of guns. The different classes feel different from each other in a good way. So it has some good gameplay variety. It is a little limited in terms of the areas that are there. It needs some more content, but it doesn't need some more content enough that I would put it in like A tier or B tier. I think it's still not bad as it is right now and just really fun. So if you're looking for another FPS roguelite that's co-op with 2 people, you can play Gunfire Reborn, or you can look at Roboquest as well. They're both pretty good. They have their own flaws, but I would put Roboquest in A+ tier right now. Sure, I think it has potential, as Gunfire Reborn does, to go up to S tier if they address some of the issues with it, keep working on it. But for now, in its early access stage of development, I'm going to put it in A+ tier. Rogue Legacy is one of the classic modern roguelites, which is kind of an oxymoron in some ways, but it's a platformer roguelite with a very heavy focus on cross-run progression. It's very grind heavy. It's very focused on leveling up and farming and those kind of things that might turn it off to roguelite fans. And those are actually reasons why I'm going to put it in A tier. I really like the combat. I really like the game systems. I like Rogue Legacy as a whole because of those things. But I was just so turned off by the grind that was required that I never really beat the game. I played it a lot and I enjoyed playing through it, but I didn't really want to beat it because I had so much farming, so much grinding that I had to do. And there's even a class in the game that helps you farm faster. That's how ingrained grinding and farming is to the game. And I'm just not really looking for that when I'm playing a roguelite. So we're going to put Rogue Legacy in A tier. And next, we're going to look at Rogue Star Rescue. And this is a kind of unique roguelite, not as unique as some of the other ones that I called unique, but it mixes top-down twin stick shooter bullet hell elements with tower defense elements during boss fights. It kind of feels like Enter the Gungeon with tower defense elements, though not as good as Enter the Gungeon for sure. I'm going to put this game in A tier. It has a lot of cool things in the game. It has a lot of cool game mechanics. I like the tower defense elements, but all of the gameplay elements feel slightly shallow. They all feel like they need a little more depth. The developers are still updating the game. They keep adding new features, but I think that the game just needs some more depth to it. It really needs something there to keep you run after run. It needs something there to really make the combat feel more satisfying too. It just all feels good, but nothing in the game feels great. And so because of that, A tier for Rogue Star Rescue. Rumours from Elsewhere. I'm not sure if this game is early access or not, but it feels slightly unfinished. So Rumours of Elsewhere is a platformer roguelite where you play as up to 12 or so different classes with different abilities you can manage. You have to fight through these areas, defeat enemies, unlock chests, and go to the portal to get to the next areas. And it has some cross-run progression upgrades as well. I think this is a game that has a ton of potential. I think there's a lot of things at the core of this game that are really great. And I want to play this game in a very polished and finished state, but it's just not there right now. Or maybe it is now. Maybe they've updated it since. But when I played it originally, it just wasn't quite there. And the developer has announced that they're trying to address a lot of these issues. They've announced that they're trying to fix a lot of the problems people have with the game in their reviews. And so it's possible that this game will be higher, and I hope it does. I think it has a lot of potential. I think the concepts are great. I think the different classes are fun, but it just feels off with the combat. It feels off with some of the AI pathing and things like that make it harder to place above B tier. So good concept, good foundation perhaps, but some major flaws that can't let me place it in A tier. And now for Skul, the Hero Slayer. So this is a platformer roguelite where you fight through enemies playing as Skul, you fight through humans, and you have different attacks and movesets and abilities depending on which 2 Skuls you have equipped. It's also, I don't know if I would call it progression heavy, but it has a pretty decent amount of progression in the game as well. I would put Skul in A+ tier, at least from what I played so far. I haven't played it as much as I played some of the other games on this list, but from what I played so far, it's fun, but it's not quite the same level as some of the S tier grades as I have on my list. It just doesn't feel quite as responsive combat-wise, not quite as satisfying, but as a whole, still a really great game. If you're looking for a platformer roguelite, it's hard to go wrong with Skul, even if it's not as great as Dead Cells, for example. And now, Slay the Spire. If you're not familiar with Slay the Spire, it's also one of the more popular roguelites out there. It's a card game roguelite where you play as one of 3, now 4 different heroes and fight your way up the spire using the different cards you find and fighting various enemies. One of the big pluses for me for Slay the Spire versus other card game roguelites is 1, it was one of the first, but 2, it's very balanced. Compared to some other card game roguelites, it doesn't feel as reliant as RNG on getting certain cards on those elements. And it also can be pretty hard and punishing. There's a lot of different challenges to face, so if you want a challenge, Slay the Spire can definitely offer that. I'm going to put this game in S+ tier. Slay the Spire is one of my most played roguelites. I think it's my second most played roguelite after Hades now, and I've just always had fun with it. It's super satisfying, challenging when I want it to be challenging, not challenging when I don't want it to be challenging, and just a great game as a whole. Obviously has some flaws, but one of my top 5 favorite roguelites, so S+ tier is definitely where it belongs for me. I'm not sure if this game is pronounced SNKRX or pronounced a different way. I picked up this game a couple days ago. I played it a couple runs. I think a bunch of streamers have been playing it or something, so it's been getting some popularity. It's a very interesting game, and so it mixes RPG, party building, and auto battler elements. You play as this snake of sorts with up to 7 different cubes, and each cube represents a different class or hero that you have equipped, and you move your snake around this battlefield, and your heroes will automatically use their abilities and fight enemies as they spawn around you. I'm going to put this game in A for now. It's really great for what it is as a minimalist game, and I've been having fun on my first couple runs, but I haven't seen the depth there yet to rank it higher. Maybe it is there. A lot of people have been playing it, so maybe there's some potential that I haven't seen yet. But overall, it seems like a pretty fun game. I've been enjoying playing through it, but nothing that's hooked me enough for me to rank it higher. But really impressive for what it is. Very minimalist and also very cheap. So if you're looking for a game that's cheap on this list, this is one of the cheapest, as well as Downwell and a couple other games. But I think it's only $3 at full price, so definitely worth checking out. Solitairica is an interesting game. So Solitairica is a mix of solitaire with roguelite elements and abilities that you can use to destroy cards or defend yourself from the enemy that attacks you. It's a very simple game, but I've always had fun playing through it. It's kind of relaxing. It's not very high stakes, and you can take your time with each move. I'm going to put it in A+ tier. It's not quite S, doesn't have that same depth, and it has some mild grind and progression to it, but it's a really fun game as a whole. Really a game that surprised me with how much I enjoyed it, surprised me with what was there in the game, the variety and those elements. So I'm going to put it in A+ tier because of the fun I've had with it. Even though it's a simple concept, it's executed very well, but there just isn't enough there to rank it any higher. And Spelunky is another pretty popular, pretty famous roguelite. It has a sequel now that apparently improves a lot in the game. Spelunky is a platformer roguelite where you try to clear a bunch of areas, progress to the next one, fight different enemies, collect items. And it's pretty easy to pick up and understand, but it has a lot of depth to it. It has a high skill ceiling. There's a lot to master with the game. For me, I never liked Spelunky as much as some other people. I can tell there's a lot of depth to the game, but I'm not a big fan of games with hard platforming elements. And I guess Spelunky doesn't have as hard platforming elements as some other games, but it's still very platforming heavy in a way that I didn't always enjoy. And it's very punishing. It's pretty easy to get comboed to death if you do something wrong. I'm going to put Spelunky in A+ tier because personally, I just didn't enjoy it as much as the S tier games. I know for some people it's their favorite. I always had fun playing through it, but it wasn't the type of game that really hooked me. It wasn't the type of game that I wanted to play a ton of. And so for that reason, A+ tier. Tangledeep. So this game has a classic and roguelike feel to it with a turn-based nature, heavy RPG elements, lots of different classes, items to level up those classes, different abilities to learn and master. And it's a pretty fun game. I've been playing through it an okay amount. I think I'm going to put it in A+. It's probably not as good as some true classic roguelites, but as you can see on this list, I haven't really played a lot of true classic roguelites, but it has a lot there that I've really enjoyed, has a lot of elements to explore, there's a lot of room for mastery, just a lot there that I've enjoyed, but not fun enough that I would put it in S tier. It has some flaws, some things like pacing can be a little slow at times, but overall, a pretty good game, which is how I define A+ tier, but not great. And so A+ is where I'm going to put Tangle Deep. And now for the Binding of Isaac, which is maybe the most popular roguelite ever, or certainly at least one of the top few roguelites that has ever been published. There is the base game, Rebirth. There's also several different expansions that have been released for it. I'm going to rank this as if it has all the expansions. If it's only Rebirth, it's probably still pretty similar ranking. But anyways, Isaac, if you're not familiar, is a top-down action roguelite with the focus on gameplay variety and synergies and passive stacking. You get a bunch of items that synergize with each other in various ways and change your moveset and attacks in a lot of ways as well. I'm going to put Isaac in S tier. I'm not sure if I'd quite put it in S+, but maybe I would at some point in the future. There's a lot that I still haven't seen in the game, even though I played the game a lot. There's just so much content to explore. There's so many items to unlock. There's so many secrets to explore. There's so many synergies to find. There's just so much there. But there are some things I don't like about it, such as the heavy reliance on RNG. And I also don't like the theme or art style of the game that much. It's a complaint that I've always had with this game. It's one of the reasons I didn't try it for a really long time, despite being into roguelites, because I just didn't want to play that game with that art style. But overlooking that, it's a really great game. There's just so much there. Maybe I will... I don't know if I want to put it S+ or not. I guess I'll just put it S+ for now. There's a lot that I like about it. It's really good. We'll see. I'm going to leave it S+ for now. We'll come back to it at the end and see if I want to move it back down to S tier. And now, the Dungeon Beneath. So, the Dungeon Beneath is an auto-battler roguelite. We have a hero and a party of allies, and you fight the enemy hero and their allies and try to defeat them all as quickly as you can and try to move on to the next area. You can level up your heroes, equip items on them between runs, so it has some RPG elements as well, as you would expect from that type of game. I'm going to put the Dungeon Beneath. I'm not sure if I want to put it in A or A+. I'm not sure if I've quite played it enough to rank it fairly between those two, if we're going to be honest. I'm just going to put it in A for now. It has a lot of things that I like about it. It has some good RPG elements. The combat's fun. It's satisfying to play through. But it has some limitations in regards to the role of RNG. Occasionally get these challenges that feel insurmountable, like maybe you shouldn't be encountering them yet. Some boss fights that are really hard. But I've liked the variety as I played through it. And I've liked what I've seen with the game so far. So I'm going to put it in A tier. I'm going to feel satisfied with that choice. Tiny Shot. So this is another game by a solo developer. And you play as this character in a platformer-like game. And you shoot enemies around you. And it has a pretty simple gameplay loop. You shoot enemies around you, collect loot from them, and try to kill a certain number, defend against a wave, or you can move on to the next area, the next stage, etc. I think Tiny Shot, for what it is as a solo developer game, it's nice, but removing the context of its development and just looking at it as a roguelite, I'm going to put it in B tier. There are some qualities of it that are fun. I had some fun playing through it, but I also don't really want to replay it. The core combat is a little lacking in terms of what it is. Could definitely use some improvement. You also get hit by enemies sometimes where you don't see projectiles coming. There just isn't enough there in terms of the depth of the combat. There isn't enough there in terms of the depth of the gameplay systems. Even though it has some cool things like a grappling hook that are fun to use, it's just missing a lot. I think it could be moved up in the future, but for where it is right now, I'm going to put Tiny Shot in B tier. The next roguelite is Tokyo, the Tower of Perpetuity. I'm going to put this game in A tier. This game is a platformer roguelite that has a kind of unique theme to it. Basically, every day there's one tower, and every day all the players try to climb up the same tower and get as far as they can and rack up as high of a score as they can. And you compete against each other on these leaderboards every single day to see how well you can do. The game also is unique, so you don't have basic attacks, but rather your only attack is a special ability that you can use on a relatively long timer, every 20-30 seconds or so, depending on what hero you use. I'm not super into platformers, as I mentioned a couple other times earlier, but it was still a very fun game to play through at times. It's very limited in what it is though, because you're always playing the same tower every single day. Every 24-hour period has one tower, and then it's a new tower for the next 24-hour periods. So it has a fun mastery quality if you want to do that. You play the same tower, you can learn from your mistakes, but it's also limited because of that. You play a couple runs on a given day, and then you feel kind of done with it. Or at least I felt kind of done with it because I didn't want to keep playing the same tower forever. It was fun to play the same tower a couple runs, but after that, it got a little lacking. Still in early access, so it's possible there's going to be some improvement in the future. But for where it is right now, it's a pretty solid A tier game. And now, Tower of Guns. This is kind of a funny game. It's an FPS roguelite where you fight through this, as the name says, Tower of Guns. And you can start with several different guns after you unlock them. And there are also different upgrades you can find for the guns, different abilities you can use. It's definitely not a super serious game, but it also doesn't take itself too seriously either. I kind of liked the laid-back nature of it and had fun playing through it. I'm going to put it in A tier because I had fun playing through it, but it also lacks a lot of depth compared to some other games. It lacks some replayability compared to some other games, but it's still a good game as a whole. And so because of that, it lends itself solidly in A tier. Trials of Fire is another interesting hybrid roguelite. It mixes tactical RPG elements with card game deck builder elements. Basically, you play as a party of 3 characters that have their own decks. So between runs, you build up their decks by finding different cards, upgrading them, and equipping the heroes with equipment as well, which adds cards to their deck. Within each fight, the combat's a tabletop feel, where each character has a tile piece, and you use your cards to attack enemies, move characters, defend your heroes, etc. I liked Trials of Fire, but I think it doesn't have the replayability that I would like from it. It was one of those games that I really, really enjoyed, and then once I played it a little bit more, it really fell off. There is an overworld element to the game, and that got stale to me pretty quickly. So I think Trials of Fire deserves to be in the A+ tier. There's a lot the game offers that's unique. It's fun to play through, but it's also limited by some elements that make it not S tier, such as that lack of long-term replayability compared to some of the other games on this list. Undermine is actually the game that I just reviewed in this channel, so if you want a longer review of Undermine, be sure to check that out. And it's a pretty fun game. It's a top-down action roguelite, as a lot of these games are, and it's a very progression-heavy game. There's a lot of upgrades, there's a lot of vertical progression, you can make yourself more powerful, you can buff yourself across runs, and it also has some story and narrative elements that are nice as well. It's kind of limited by the items, so it's a passive stacker game, kind of like Isaac or Risk of Rain 2, but the items don't have very large impacts on the move set. So I'm going to put it in A+, because it's really fun to play through. It's kind of fun until it isn't. It's kind of fun until you reach limitations of the variety, until you just want more move sets, you want items to have larger impact, those kind of things. So I'm going to put it in A+ tier because I really had fun playing through it. But now that I've kind of beat it a couple times, I don't really want to play it again, for now anyways. I've heard there's some updates on the way, so we'll see how big of an impact those have. Urban Cards. This is a card game. It has a tabletop feel to it. It's inspired by Magic the Gathering and those type of card games. It also feels a bit like Hearthstone or other PvP card games at times with how it's structured, and there actually is a PvP game mode as well. I'm going to put Urban Cards in A+ tier. I think it's somewhat similar to Undermine in the sense that it's really fun until it kind of isn't. It has a fun core gameplay loop. I liked the card structure. There's an okay amount of variety of different factions you can play as. I liked exploring deck synergies. It also has a soft vertical progression with unlocks. You unlock stronger cards later on, but it's really lacking in terms of variety. Once you've kind of explored the different decks, once you can beat the game pretty consistently, there isn't that much else to do unless you want to turn to PvP, which personally I did not, because I don't really love PvP card games. So Urban Cards, solid A+ tier. Void Bastards. Personally, I'm not sure this game really is a roguelite. It kind of borders on being one, but there's some other games on here like Darkest Dungeon that maybe aren't roguelites also. So we're going to include Void Bastards. And what it is it's an FPS roguelite that has a looter shooter feel to it. You land on ships, you fight enemies on these ships, and you loot around until you find what you want on that ship, and you use those items you find to upgrade yourself across runs and build certain items that help progress the story. The story itself is very absurdist, but it's also pretty funny to follow as well. It's not going to necessarily scratch a narrative itch, but it is a nice progression for the game. I'm going to put Void Bastards, I want to put it in A or A+. It has some things that I really like in it. The combat's fun. Some of the weapons are really fun to experiment with, but it also doesn't have the best gameplay loop. It feels a little limited at times. I'm just going to put it in A tier. Maybe deserves to be an A+, but I don't feel too bad about putting it in A tier either. A lot of things that are good with the game, but nothing that are bad with it. I don't think it necessarily deserves to be much higher with some of these other roguelites on this list. Voidigo. This game's still in early access, and it's still pretty early in early access. There's only been 1 or 2 big updates to the game. This game has a ton of potential. I'm really looking forward to seeing this game at its full release. It reminds me a lot of Nuclear Throne with the combat system. It's a top-down action roguelite It's not quite a bullet hell, though it has some bullet hell elements, but it has a very chaotic feel to it. And the game also has a lot of ranged weapons and melee weapons. It's one of the only twin stick shooter roguelites that has a big focus on melee weapons. I'm going to put Voidigo in A tier for now, which kind of hurts because I think this game has so much potential. I think when this game is finished, when it has its full release, it'll definitely be at least A+, maybe S tier, that might be stretching it, but it has so much potential, and I've had a lot of fun playing through it, but there's just not enough content there now to really justify putting it any higher. It's missing the meta progression, it's missing different character classes, it's missing enemy variety, really boss variety. It's a very boss-focused game, and so because of that, I'm going to put it in A tier. But I do really expect this game to be ranked higher up. Once it's further along in development, I think it has a lot of potential. Wizard of Legend, I don't know where I want to put this game. This is another hard one for me. I can tell there are some good elements in this game, but I've never really gotten into it. Never had that much fun while playing it. So it's a brawler, beat 'em up type of game, top down, where you play as wizards and use various spells to combo with each other and fight off enemies as you progress through areas with different boss fights as well. I don't know where to put it. As I mentioned, I've never really gotten into it. I've tried a number of times to get into it, but I just haven't been able to. Maybe I'll put it in B tier. It feels kind of disrespectful to it. Okay, I'm going to put it in A tier, actually. I think this game has some great elements to it, as I mentioned. I think the biggest problem I have with it is I haven't been able to get used to the combat system. It's a very punishing game. It's a very hard game. And the combat feels kind of clunky to me. But I think that clunkiness could be gotten used to. I think a lot of it is aftercast timers, sort of delays after abilities before you can do anything. I think if I adjusted, it would have some potential, but I just haven't been able to. I don't think it really belongs in B tier because of that. So I'm going to put it in A tier. I don't know if that justification is good, but we're going to put Wizard of Legend in A tier. It has some diehard fans. Maybe one of those fans could tell me why it deserves to be higher. But for now, we're going to put it in A tier. Now, Ziggurat, which is another FPS roguelite, it has an arena shooter-like feel to it, where you fight through this small area where enemies are in the area, you quiz enemies from this room, and then you move on to the next room. Maybe I'll put Ziggurat in B tier. I was pretty disappointed in this game. The combat itself felt pretty limited. Because you're always clearing out rooms and fighting through them, I feel like I was always just running a circle around a room and shooting towards the middle, which wasn't very satisfying and kind of got boring after a while. I also felt like there was a limitation with the different item variety, the different weapons you can use, but maybe that's because I just didn't get far enough. And also some of the bosses that I fought were just not that interesting. I'm not sure. I know this game also has some fans, so maybe some of them could tell me what I'm missing in the game. I think I'm going to put it in B tier because I think it has some good ideas, but nothing felt that special about it, especially in light of all these other FPS roguelites that we have now, like Roboquest, like Gunfire Reborn. I'm not sure why you would play Ziggurat over those. And so because of that, I'm going to put it in B tier. This game does have a sequel now. I have not tried it yet, so I'm not sure if it improves a lot of the game, but I also had some performance issues with it. It didn't really run that well. Had some frame rate drops when I tried to sprint, some weird load-ins where there were no walls, and then suddenly they appeared. So we're going to put that in B tier. Zombie Party, which again is going to be the last game I put on the list. Risk of Rain, didn't mean to include that here as an icon. I have it, but I have not yet played it. So Zombie Party is an action roguelite, bullet hell game with a ton of enemies that spawn. And it's a game that doesn't take itself seriously at all. It's very whimsical. It's very silly. You get a lot of absurd guns on the runs that have just comical effects. And it's a fun game for what it is, but it's not a very deep game. And so for that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier because I think it's solid. I think it's okay. I think it has some good elements to it, but it's certainly not great. It's certainly not even pretty good. It is what it is, and that's fun, that's whimsical, but not much depth, not much room for mastery. Yeah, I think I've said enough about it. Solid A tier roguelite, Zombie Party. Yeah, so let's just go back through this list and see what I think about it. S+ tier, Dead Cells, Hades Monster Train. Isaac is the one I was kind of unsure about. I'm going to leave Isaac in S+. There's just so much there to explore. And I've been having a lot of fun just coming back to it. And I think maybe if we did it right now, it kind of straddle the line between S and S+, how I feel about it. but I feel pretty confident that I'm only going to like it more. So yeah, I'm going to leave Isaac in S+. S tier, I feel fine about all these as well. I don't think any of these need to be moved up for me. I don't think any of these need to be moved down either. Nuclear Throne, you know, personal bias there, personal preference is my first roguelite ever. I think the rest of that's fine with me. A+, I feel good about this as well. Nothing here that I need to move up or down. These are all pretty good games. Nothing quite yet on the edge of great. Gunfire Reborn, Roboquest, they certainly could be S at some point in the future, but I don't think they're quite there. Children of Morta, I don't think that's quite S tier for me either. I haven't played enough of the Family Trials mode to have a full opinion on it. Maybe as I play that more, that'll push it to S. I don't think so though, because I was so disappointed with the story ending. So I think this is all good for me. A tier, I think I'm fine with all of these two. Dungeons of the Endless. There's a couple of these that kind of could flex between these two. Dungeons of the Endless, I think, could potentially be A+. It has some pretty big flaws, but if those flaws don't bother you, I guess it's A+. They did bother me though, so I guess this is my tier list. We'll keep that in A. Neoverse, I'm fine with that, where this is right now. Actually, do I want to raise Neoverse? We'll just leave it there. But Neoverse maybe kind of the one that straddles the edge between A+ and A. B tier games, I feel fine with these as well. C tier games, I'm also fine with those choices. So yeah, this is my roguelite tier list. Let's zoom out a little bit so you can see it all at once. Get all the games there. This is a screenshot that I'll take. Show this as the tier list. So yeah, let me know if you like this video. Let me know what games you would place where. If you would switch something around. If you think I've made some egregious errors in any of these rankings, let me know in the comments. And if you want to make your own tier list with these games, I'll put a link in the description below so you can customize that yourself. And yeah, if you want to see some more casual videos like this from me, unscripted, this type of structure, I'm not sure what else I would do. I'm going to keep my reviews scripted, of course, but if there's some other casual type of video you'd want to see, something like a tier list maybe, let me know in the comments and I'll consider doing that in the future. And yeah, thanks for watching.